The Theosophical Society presents Joy Mills in a talk entitled From Concentration to Imagination.
Now we come tonight then, in our series of studies on meditation, to what I think are two most important aspects of the subject, two factors which all writers, East and West, every book on meditation, whether it deals with the Western systems of meditation, the systems of Christian meditation, the various systems within the Western types of meditation, or the Eastern types of meditation, Buddhist, Hindu, Chinese, whatever. All books on meditation agree are two very essential factors that must be involved in the systematic and orderly practice of meditation. And anyone who has attempted meditation at all, who has said, I'm at least going to try and engage in meditation, immediately comes up against these. These aspects are known first as concentration, the ability to focus the mind on a given object or idea for a given period of time, concentration, and imagination, or visualization, the ability to direct the mind. Now, this isn't just the, again, flight of imagination where one gives free rein to whatever arises, but imagination coupled with concentration in the directed purposefulness of it, so that it is imagination as an ability to direct the mind to build pictures or images in accordance with the command of the immortal self or under the direction of the will. And tonight I want to try some experiments in this and have you participate and see how far we can go in this. But first, let's look at these two aspects a little bit. Concentration. I suppose there are very few people who have no difficulty at all in concentrating the mind. Now, I suppose it's possible that some of you have minds well disciplined, well controlled, so that you never think a thought, you never have a thought pass through your mind that you have not determined will be present. But if you have, that's marvelous. You should be giving the talk and not I. But I suppose for most of us, there are times when we find ourselves thinking about something that we never intended to think about. Or we find ourselves far, far removed from the subject we may have chosen to meditate on or to contemplate. Perhaps, for example, even since I began speaking, which is about 10 minutes ago, 8 minutes ago, I suppose you have heard and listened attentively to every single word I have said. Nowhere along the line in the last 8 or 10 minutes has your mind sort of wandered off somewhere. That's wonderful. I knew I had your rapt and complete and whole attention, you know. But I suspect that your mind has been having its own adventures, and that you may have heard, and our attention span varies. This psychologist knows, so you may have heard some words now and then, and suddenly your mind was off, perhaps carrying on a little argument with me, saying, you know, I wish you'd get on with it, or this is repeating stuff I've already heard, and how did I get myself into this tonight? Well, it's cozy for a while, so I'll stay, but I wonder how it's going to be going home, and so on. Your mind has been doing all sorts of things. Well, in one sense, this is all right, because the whole evolutionary development of the mind has taken place in a way that fosters a certain speed of response to stimuli. So this is why I say, in a certain sense, this is all right. That you have minds, that we all have minds that are quick to respond, to move, that have a real speed of mobility. Because the whole evolutionary process in the development of the mind is the bringing about of a condition in consciousness in which there is this kind of speed of response and a mobility of the mind. That is, the mind has become accustomed to moving swiftly from stimulus to stimulus, alert to sensations from without, turning attention quickly from one thing to another. Now, this has been part of the evolutionary process because it is part of the process of protection of one's incarnation, for example. You see, if you walk out into the street and you are so concentrated on spiritual liberation that you fail to hear the automobile horn that's suddenly honking at you, you are in danger of losing a rather precious possession, your body, an incarnation. So it is well that the mind has become alert, you see. So this is nothing against it. But we are at a stage in evolution in consciousness where now we have to begin to tame the mind, to train it, to bring it under control of something else, the self, the immortal part of our being, you see. Without losing this mobility, this extreme responsiveness to outer stimuli, but to learn to discriminate between the times when it is useful for the mind to respond in that manner to outer stimuli, and those times when we want to turn off all outer sensation, as it were, and not regard it, not regard the outer sensations. And here is the tough battle, isn't it, you see? Because when you sit down to meditate and begin the practice of concentration as the first step in meditation, the mind is still going on and responding to outer sensations. A fly rests at the tip of your nose, you see. Now, the mind has been customarily in the habit of reacting, you see, so that a sense stimulus is present, and there is an automatic reaction to brush the fly off. Well, we'll come to some of this, and I have a story to tell you a little later on. But here we are confronted with the need, then, to quiet the mind, to help it stay in place, as it were, to focus on one thing to the exclusion of all other outer stimuli and sensations. Dr. Annie Besant, in her superb analysis and very helpful survey of this entire process, and those of you who may not be familiar with it, I certainly recommend her little book, Thought Power, which is very basic and very helpful and begins right at the beginning, as it were, with this whole matter of concentration and gives some marvelous clues to it. She comments on this difficulty which confronts us by saying this: while the mind is collecting materials for thought, extreme mobility is an advantage. And for many, many lives, the mind grows through this mobility. This is what I've been saying earlier. The stoppage of this habit of running outwards in every direction, the imposition of fixed attention on a single point, this change naturally comes with a jar and a shock. I think it's marvelous, because it does. The mind is, I've got to be, who thinks he's going to control me, says the mind, as it were. And the mind plunges wildly like an unbroken horse when it first feels the bit. And you remember last week we used the analogy, which is used in so many books, of the charioteer and the horses. The horses being the three horses who should be driven in tandem the three horses of the mind, the emotions, and the body. Should be driven in unison, neither one going out of kilter, as it were, and carrying the chariot of the of the whole purpose of existence off into one line or another. So concentration is simply a mental challenge. In the East, the mind has often been compared to a monkey, which I think is a marvelous comparison, with its tendency to leap about from branch to branch and follow an endless pattern of activity. And it's interesting, in the West, in the Greek tradition, the very word psyche, which is the Greek term for that whole mental emotional principle, which has often been called the soul, is the Greek word for butterfly. So you can have a monkey or a butterfly, whichever you prefer. A tendency, in other words, of restless activity and to leap about. This analogy, of course, I think not only illustrates the restlessness of the mind, but also indicates the fact that the mind is a real entity, a part of ourselves with its own identity and with its own inclinations, sometimes acting rather independently from the instructions we may give it, as we well know. So, as has been suggested by some writers, it may be necessary to induce meditation, in order to get started in meditation, to sort of play games with the mind, sort of get it into the proper frame of doing what we think it ought to do, and to play with the mind with skill rather than bludgeon it into obedience. Because obviously, you cannot bludgeon it without damaging its power to be a useful instrument. You cannot drug it, you see, and say, well, look, my mind is so active, and I want it to do what I think it ought to, so I will simply drug it. You see, I'll put it to sleep. Well, a lot of good the mind is then. You're not in a state of meditation, you're in a state of drugged sleep, you see, and so be honest about it. So you have to use the mind and use its mobility and its restlessness with skill. Just as, you see, the best racehorse is not one that's, ready for the glue factory sort of thing, not the old, horse that can hardly limp around but obeys you constantly. It's the horse that is all primed and alert, but well directed. Ernest Wood, for example, in his excellent book on concentration, has pointed out that in all of these matters we must do no violence. As he says, we are not hard and lofty masters, whipping a wild animal into sullen obedience. To command the mind is one thing. To teach it as a willing and happy pupil, continually finding new delights of experience in healthy functioning, is quite another. So, how do we get the mind to play with us, to do what we want, as it were? How can we, I suppose, trick it, catch its attention, you see, capture its attention? It may be useful, I think, to, in order to engage in the practice of concentration, to intrigue the mind by presenting it with an object or idea which will elicit its cooperation, because the mind is interested in whatever the idea happens to be. Actually, you see, there are two kinds of concentration. One is spontaneous and automatic, and the other is deliberate and controlled. And perhaps the easy way is to move from what may be called deliberate and spontaneous concentration, to discover what the mind does then, and move from that to deliberate and controlled concentration. We can begin with the one, in other words, and gradually develop the other. For example, if you are convinced that you have a very good control over the mind because you find it very easy to focus on a subject of interest to you Then determine to concentrate for 5 minutes on a subject that has no interest for you. And you will discover a great number of things about your mind. Of course you have good control in concentration on a subject that is of intense interest to you. Time goes by, you lose sight of all external things. The telephone can ring and you don't hear it. Dinner is called and you don't come, you're not hungry, it never enters your mind. But concentrate for 5 minutes on something that has no interest whatsoever to you, and you're sure it's time for dinner half an hour ago, and all sorts of things, the window ought to be opened or closed, or various things need to be done. I know, I have a trick. When I'm writing something that I have to write, as many of you know, I write each month in our monthly journal, the American Theosophist. And sometimes I'm up against a deadline. Our editor here, Virginia Hansen, reminds me that it's due. And so I sit at my typewriter and I have an idea, but I've got to focus it down and work it out, and this is a long, laborious process at times of concentration. So I suddenly see that my typewriter is dirty, and so I take out my brush and I brush out all of the things, And then I think, well, maybe if I had another piece of paper. And then I realize the room is too warm, and I get up and move over and turn off the heat. And then I come back and I look at the paper, and finally, well, these are the ways we do. So I'm honest, I'll share with you what I do. And I'm not asking you to share what you do, but this is what goes on. Now, you may find, of course, if you really look at this matter of the difference between concentration when you're absorbed in a subject and concentration when you just can't get your mind to focus on it, that there is present or absent one factor. In other words, that there is one factor, we could say, that is present in spontaneous concentration that is always present no matter what the subject, and that is some strong emotional or mental motivation, a desire, an interest, excitement, and so on. All of these pull the mind, don't they, to a focus, as it were, pull our thoughts to a focus. And I think this may be the clue in helping us with the development of concentration as a deliberate and controlled practice. Now, how can we invest the subject on which we consciously determine to focus the mind in concentration? How can we invest it with a strong motive? This is the heart of the question in getting ourselves into the initial stages of concentration. Here, I suggest, is where imagination or visualization come into play and may be very helpful in enticing the mind to concentrating. Now, this is not yet meditation. This is a first step, however. It is a preliminary step and an essential step on the stairway of meditation. In one sense, it's rather like telling the willful and restless child that if he will focus on his homework and really get it done, he will be rewarded with a certain amount of freedom after that. So it's telling the mind, now, please, just for 10 minutes, you're going to focus. You're going to consider this subject or object, whatever it may be. And then after that, I'll let you, sort of go outdoors and play. Think about anything you want to think about. Concentrate for a while and then go about your usual activity. So it is that deliberate, controlled concentration is carried out under the orders of the self, and there may be very little emotional urge or desire behind it. In fact, the order may even be rather dull and unattractive to the mind. But the determination has come from a deeper center within. And this, of course, is the determination that must be present all along the way in learning to meditate and in the practice of meditation. Well, we might use as an example. Let us say that I place before you a number of random lines, just random lines and shapes, and I ask you to concentrate on them. Here is, for example, I'm going to just show it to you, you see, and I'm going to say these random shapes you are to concentrate on. You are to concentrate on them so that you can recall precisely what they look like. This is one of the exercises in concentration. To look at something, let us say, for 5 minutes, and then to be able to reproduce it, you see. Now that's rather difficult, isn't it? And this is rather meaningless, isn't it? But if I suggest to you first, if you can take these two figures here, this rectangle and this rhomboid shape, and you begin to imagine something. Can your mind imagine what they are? What do you see there? Let's say just this rectangular shape. What do you see? What do you imagine as you look at that? An envelope? A coin purse? A bow tie and a striped shirt. You see, the imagination really can move out, can't it? Anything else that anyone sees there? A candle and flame. That's interesting. A hat. A child. Oh, a wall.
A dressing table with a mirror.
A dressing table with a mirror. Now, having done that, your interest is aroused, isn't it? And how much easier to concentrate through imagination so that when I put this down, you are more likely to recall the shape there, are you not? Now that you have invested it with some imaginative quality, characteristics. Do you see? This is how imagination can be used to pull along the mind towards concentration. Very simple little exercise, but perhaps useful to illustrate this, at least. Because in the process of this exercise of imagination, you find yourself concentrating. And all of you, the moment I said, imagine what that might be, began concentrating on it, seeing it, really focusing. And so all of your thoughts were pulled together towards that particular set of lines and drawing and so on. Now, of course, when we come to abstract and spiritual matters, there is an intangible quality which makes it genuinely difficult for the mind to find something to take hold of, something it can really focus on. Yet I think even here we can gain a certain aid from the emotional nature through aspiration, through dedication and other altruistic motives. And the exercise I'd like to try a little bit later towards the close will illustrate this, I think. But a few other points first. I think it must always be remembered that concentration is not a state of passivity. And this little exercise indicates that. It's not a state of passivity. It's a state of intense and regulated activity. You were pulled, as it were. Thought was pulled towards the image which I presented to you. And so it resembles, concentration resembles in the mental world, as Dr. Besant has pointed out, the gathering up of the muscles for a leap in the physical world. It resembles this. And I think the analogy is quite apt. For just as when one focuses or draws together all of one's physical energies to do something, say to run or to leap or whatever it may be. One gathers all one's physical resources, and then afterwards there is a release and a feeling of fatigue. So very often there comes a physical fatigue after prolonged concentration. One of the reasons why it should not be engaged in too long, because the physical body also needs its due, as it were. It must be given its attention. Its needs must be provided for. And so often there comes about this sort of interior, what has been called a kind of biological clock that alerts us to the fact that the body is tired. Concentration now may cease because the body has actually felt its reaction in terms of a fatigue. Another point I think should not be overlooked: some types of minds are by nature perhaps more diffuse, and concentration is more difficult, therefore, for some people than for others. And I think this shouldn't bother us. We say, I've been trying to concentrate for years, and someone, your neighbor, says, gee, that's so simple. I really have got that step down. I can immediately concentrate. I think we should just try to assess our own abilities and capacities, our strengths and weaknesses, and take courage from our assets and work then at whatever our deficiencies seem to be. For example, perhaps it may be necessary for those who tend to be dreamy and vague to work at developing their minds along objective lines, to train themselves to a precision of observation through concentration, a real precision of observation, while those who are over-objective, who are inclined to be critical, inclined to be very precise, may need to cultivate a little more imagination and ability to think abstractly, so that we balance these factors. Of course, a very simple exercise in concentration is looking at a picture or a building and then jotting down all the details remembered from that perception. This should be done, however, with some precision, checking the results. Go back and look. What did you leave out? Or evoke, if you are the very precise kind, evoke a picture in your imagination. Hold it steadily in the mind's eye and build in carefully every detail, and then let go of it. Withdraw from it. Such an exercise, of course, evokes the power to visualize as well as to concentrate and recall. And in this, of course, one comes up against some of the problems of imagination, which has its own problems too, the tricks that imagination can play upon us if we are not alert. And so the imagination, which is really very important, because in its creativity, it is one of the valuable instruments we have for meditation, can also play tricks on us, aiding and abetting the mind in its desire to escape from concentration. It can aid concentration, and it can also aid the mind to escape from concentration, as we can wander off. So imagination is both reproductive and creative, and it can function at several levels. Imagination has links with sensation, with feeling, with thinking, and with intuition. And creative imagination can be trained. A simple exercise, for example, in creative imagination is to picture a triangle. Can all of you picture a triangle? Close your eyes and see a triangle. Very simple. Now, extend the lines to form a diamond. Can you do that? You see the diamond? And you hold the diamond steady? And now deepen that image until it is three-dimensional and becomes a many-faceted jewel. Can you see that? This is just a very simple exercise. Come back. You can then take the three-dimensional effect out and come back to the diamond, back to the triangle, and let it dissipate. It's a marvelous little exercise in training the mind and imagination, you see. Very simple. The essence of any exercise in imagination, however, is that we should not be carried away by the imaginative faculty. Again, we determine where we go, the triangle to the diamond to the jewel and back. Not off, diamond searching in South Africa, for example, or in the jewelry store. All of that, you see. We have determined. In other words, we select what is to be imagined, and the whole process is kept under our command. And this, of course, is the central point in all meditation. As we have pointed out earlier in our discussions, the self must be in command, consciously so, with discrimination always present, the power to choose. So, of course, in this, the will comes into play. Will which involves motive also. And the will is really the divine aspect in man, which puts him in rapport, in harmony with the very essence of life, with reality, with the purpose synthesizing all life. So all exercises in imagination and concentration, I suggest, ultimately involve the will. So we may need to train the will, or rather to permit that immortal self to come through and use the mind as a trained instrument. Actually, as I say, it's not so much a training of the will, which ends up being a won't power, I won't do this and I won't do that sort of thing, as a permitting of the essence of will, the essence of what we are truly, the essence of the self, to take hold of our lives and direct our existence in a purposeful manner. And as we've said earlier in earlier meetings, for that we need the coordination of the physical body, trained to respond, the emotions, trained also to respond, not reacting, but feeling as we determine they will feel, and the mind. That coordination can be achieved, I suggest, by learning some of the principles of concentration. And this brings us back to the focus in the mind. One of the great Western students of meditation and concentration, giving rise to much of the system of the great Christian mystics of the medieval period, St. Dionysius wrote that 3 things were required to attain spiritual vision. The first, he said, the first is possession of one's mind. Are we in possession of the mind? To learn to concentrate is to be in possession of one's mind. The second is a mind that is free, which means simply a mind that is not pulled by the emotions, not subject to the emotional swamping that can take place, not subject to prejudice, a mind that is truly free. And the third is a mind that can see. That is, a mind that looks clearly at all things, objectively, and frankly and honestly. And as he says, how can we acquire this speculative mind? By a habit of mental concentration. Very simple, you see. Again and again in Eastern methods as well as in Western schools, wherever meditation is taught or practiced, the art of concentration built up with a well-trained power of imagination is basic. Something of the difficulty of the task, and I told you earlier on I'd tell you a little story, and here I'd like to inject it in this matter of the well-trained mind. Something of the difficulty of the task is illustrated by a story that Alexandra David Neal, who did a considerable amount of traveling in the East and has written several works on Tibetan mysticism, she tells about the method used to ascertain the degree of concentration achieved by the Tibetan novice. In one of the schools in Tibet, it is customary in training the pupil to concentrate to place a small burning lamp, burning with butter, on the head of the novice. Now, such a lamp with butter in it burns for a very long time. But of course, the slightest movement of the pupil will cause the lamp, it's a rather small butter lamp. I don't know how many of you have seen these butter lamps, which are very, you can get them in India as well as in Tibet. The slightest movement, it would fall off. Well, in this particular case, the Lama or teacher had placed the burning butter lamp on the head of his student, his pupil, and he went off. And the pupil meditated, concentrated, all night. And towards morning, the lamp had gone out. The butter had been exhausted. So he took it from his head and put it on the ground. And when his teacher came back, the Lama naturally questioned him as to why the lamp was no longer on his head. Why was it there on the ground? And he said, well, the flame had stopped. It was no longer burning. I had had it on my head almost the whole night, and the flame was out, so I put it on the ground. And of course the Lama retorted sternly, how could you know that the lamp went out, or even that you had a lamp on your head, if you had reached true concentration of the mind? So of course this is what happens, you see. We do become aware of other things. We respond to other things. And concentration, if there had been absolute concentration, he would not have even known there was a lamp on his head, let alone that the butter in it had been exhausted. Well, I'd like to try an exercise then with you as our meditation this evening. So if you would take a comfortable position, and I'd like you to, for this, to close your eyes. Breathe deeply but naturally so that there is established a rhythm in the physical body. And now imagine a quiet corner on a summer's day. It is warm. You are going to build a picture of a garden. See the garden. A soft green lawn, rose bushes. In the distance, a little further away, a lake, blue, quiet. Opposite the lake, surrounding the garden, are tall trees. See those trees. Now in this garden, put a bench, a stone bench. Now you enter the garden. Seat yourself on the bench. Feel the warmth and light of the sun. Listen to the sounds of the day. Summer. Smell the scent on the air. There is peace in the garden. Now dismiss the picture. No garden, no bench, no you. Calm, peace, quiet, reign. Retain only the awareness of peace. Now bring that quality of peace into your mind, into your emotions, into your body. Your whole being vibrant with peace. And send that peace forth upon the world. Peace to all that lives. Thank you.